Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your time zone. I am George Zedgenidze, Head of Knowledge Management at the Green Climate Fund and co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group of the Scaling Up Community of Practice. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all to our 7th annual workshop of the Scaling Community of Practice and today's session on the Climate Change Working Group. The topic of the session is Scaling Climate Action post COP27 with a particular focus on climate change, climate finance action for impact at scale. For those of you who are new to the community of practice and the Climate Change Working Group, I offer a warm welcome and an open invitation to join nearly 2,500 current members of the community. It is completely voluntary and free of charge, and we're only as strong as our members. Each new voice makes us stronger. The community of practice is dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across sectors, geographies, and perspectives. In addition to this annual workshop, the community issues quarterly newsletters, produces knowledge products, and operates 9 working groups that explore scaling through the lenses of various sectors and thematic issues. Working groups typically hold quarterly meetings virtually and have a webpage of the COP's website. Thank you again for joining us. Before we start with the substance of the session, here are some of our usual housekeeping remarks. This session is being recorded. A few days after the event, we will circulate a video recording along with PowerPoint slides and a summary of the event to all of you who have registered for this session, and we will place them on the community's website. Whatever comments and questions you would like to share during today's session, please use the chat box at the top of your screen. In fact, you can enter your comments at any time during the session. The moderator and the speakers will respond with a message in the chat box or on the screen. And if it's not yet the case, please make sure your microphone is muted and the camera is turned off. Thank you. And now, to the substance of our session. We will feature our 4 distinguished panelists, Yannick Glemarec, Andrew Steer, Vera Songwe, and Ian Mitchell. It is great pleasure to introduce to you Amar Bhattacharya, who serves as a co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group along with me. Amar is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and is well-known expert on climate change. Amar will serve as today's moderator for this session, and he will set out the substance of this session today and introduce our esteemed speakers and the panelists. Let me hand over to Amar. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and special thank you to Johannes Lin, who has been the life force behind this event. And we always say we have a great panel, but I can truly say by knowing the individuals who are on this panel that it's an exceptional panel. And we are in for really a learning treat and an interaction that I hope you will find really illuminating. So in my few minutes, I want to just set the context of climate finance within the broader context of scaling up and climate action. Scaling is absolutely a vital ingredient for climate action because scaling goes hand in hand with urgency, which is the defining character of what we face on climate action. As we know from the series of IPCC reports, climate change is accelerating with more and more severe impacts, and the time for action is shrinking. So in that context, there are several dimensions in which scaling comes into play and which together define the scaling up of climate action. The first is the centrality of investment. If we want to achieve the climate goals, we will need to accelerate investment in order to replace aging and polluting capital, but also to ensure that new capital that is being built is as green and as sustainable as it can be. And the magnitudes are large, they are challenging, but they can be done. Second is the importance of innovation and technology, and now the possibilities that we have in combining green technologies with other kinds of technologies, for example, digital revolution and AI. The third lever is policies. We have to get policies right. Carbon pricing is often talked about, but policy and policy coordination extends well beyond that. And the more we work together, the better we will be in terms of scaling up and making more effective climate action. Finally, and this is the topic for, not finally, but the fourth element, which is really the topic for this session, is the centrality of finance in this agenda. And without that, we will not be able to achieve the objectives we are talking about. And it's not only about scaling up, but making climate finance more effective. Finally, and an area which I think is extremely exciting today comes under the theme of collaboration, coordination, and platforms. There is no area of action today where there are more stakeholders involved. All the way from the individual to communities, to businesses, to governments at all levels, to the international community, ranging from civil society to philanthropy to the large decision-making processes. There is tremendous amount that is happening in this space and a lot of learning. For example, Prime Minister Modi has launched this year an initiative called Lifestyle for the Environment, which is about enabling and empowering individuals to drive change away from wasteful and harmful consumption towards much more responsible consumption. It will be a major theme in this year's G20. The private sector is coming together in this agenda, for example, through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, to connect the large pools of finance on the one hand to the real sector and the opportunities on climate action. As you know, there's tremendous focus on the role of the MDBs, the examination that is happening right now, very, very centrally motivated by climate action. Private philanthropy is, enormously active. We will hear about that. And also there is a connection that is taking place between stakeholders, for example, through the Bridgetown Initiative. And of course, in the official sector, in the international organizations, the UN, the multilateral development banks, IMF, climate has reached the top of the priority agenda. The COP, meaning the UNFCCC processes, remains very important, but we are now seeing that climate is now featuring very prominently as a centerpiece in the larger international discussions, including the G7 and the G20. The proposal of setting up a climate club, for example, by the German G7 is one example of how climate is featuring very prominently. So placing that larger context, let me turn to the panel and, let me begin by introducing them, and the questions to each of them. So the first panelist that I will turn to is Vera Songwe. Vera Songwe is the chair currently of the Liquidity and Sustainable Financing Facility. She is formerly the Secretary of the Economic Commission of Africa, has been a life force in driving the climate agenda in Africa and globally. And most recently, she has served as co-chair of the independent expert group on climate finance, together with Nick Stern, a report that was commissioned by the COP26 and COP27 presidencies. And it is from that perspective, Vera, if I could ask you, how does the scaling up of climate finance look like from the perspective of your report?
Thank you very much, Amar. I don't know if you can hear me very well. Fantastic. First of all, let me thank Johannes and the team and yourselves for having me here today. I don't know if we can put up the slides, but maybe just to talk quickly, and Amar has already placed this. I'm talking and interacting here today with you under the title of my hat as co-chair of this panel on finance for climate action, which was co-chaired by Nick Stern. Amar was the secretary of the commission, but we had a very distinguished set of people with us as well. I'm not going to name everybody, but I think we also had Montek Aliwala, who is also now the India G20 partner. So we hope that this report can go out and meet many more people. Now, how does it look? I think three things, and Amar has said some of that already, is we started by trying to focus, first of all, on sort of where do we place climate in the global overall development debate. And I think as the debate around sort of should climate be an add-on, should we be part of, and we say climate is development and development is climate. So we don't want to have the debate around, you know, are we doing climate or are we doing health? I think each one of them, and as we've seen with COVID anyway, health is climate and climate is health. So there is that centrality of it. The second thing is the need for scale. We have a lot of new and nice and interesting ideas, but not scalable enough to meet the target that we have to get to. And the target that we have to get to, we need to get to it quickly. So the third one is speed. 1.5 degrees is round the corner, as the Secretary General would say. This is a battle, it's a race against time, but it's a race we can win. To win it, we have to have inject a little bit more sense of speed into the conversation. The second piece of thing then is to say, you know, around what are we going to have this conversation? Why are we having it? This is a critical moment where there is a lot of conversations around, you know, development overall, MDB reform, multilateralism at risk, globalization being questioned. How does one sort of inject this conversation into it, and around what criteria do we make the conversations around climate an important one? So that really is why climate? Why should we bother about this? And why do we need additional resources to do this? To do the why, we're thinking about, you know, how can we get a green, you know, we break it into three categories. The first category is talking about the energy transformation. The second, and I will come back to each one of this, is around loss and damage or resilience, building resilience. And the third is on natural capital. Why do we need a green transformation? We need it because, as we have seen, you know, energy security is an important part of the growth agenda. Coming from an African perspective, the climate conversation is also about growth, or is principally about growth. But I think it has now become global. We've seen in Europe and the United States with the war that it is mostly about growth as well. So essentially, looking at the timelines, we can begin to see that, particularly on the energy transformation side, there is huge progress that has been made in terms of, you know, the investments. If you think back, many of us, you know, solar panels used to cost $1, sometimes $2.25. South Africa example, for example. Today they are 40 cents. They are their lowest price. So there is a huge improvement in the technology. Just this morning, a friend of mine in Kenya was sending me Tesla batteries that they have bought for their factory, 30 megawatts of Tesla batteries. Now that, you know, if you're in Kenya, you can actually afford and you can use for your development. So this is the progress that we've seen on the energy side. On the energy side, and we will come back to that as well, is also the possibility and the sort of prevalence of the private sector with the right policy environment in place to do what we need. But the investment priorities, we must scale up. There's a huge need for scaling up our investment priorities. The report talks about going from about 2.1% of GDP of investments to somewhere in the order of 4.8% of GDP in investments to be able to meet the challenges that we are facing. The investment priorities for climate and for sustainable development, as I said, will be in these areas of energy, responding to loss and damage, which we got some progress at COP, but we shouldn't be happy because there was an announcement that there was not a creation of the capital that we need. What do we need to sustain?
Sorry to cut you off, but your video has shut off.
Oh, sorry. Just one second. Well, let me continue and then we'll work on the video part as well, because I'm trying to see if we can get the video and the slides at the same time. So can you see the slides though?
We cannot.
Oh, you cannot. Oh, sorry. Then let me come back to 1 second. Just give me 1 minute.
You are on mute.
Okay. So the next conversation was to say, so we've talked about why do we need the financing? We need the financing for the energy transformation. We need the financing for loss and damage. We need the financing for ensuring that we can further enhance our natural capital requirements. Once we say that, then we say, where are we going to get the financing from? 5 places where we're going to get the financing from, and I'll be quick. The first one is really, and the first 2 actually, are in some sense what I call sort of the negative argument, which is the first one is policy, the policy environment. I always argue that policy is finance. If you have good policy, your finances are cheaper, you get access to them faster, and it's easier for you to do development if you have good policies. So policies underpin anything that we do in the climate space, but they also underpin the investment and the cost of the investment. Policies come from ownership, country ownership, regional ownership in the case of Africa, where you have regional conversations, sometimes in the case of Asia, but you must own your policies so that you can actually design and implement them in a way that makes sense for you. So that's, I think, the first one, and we've seen that with some of the JETPs. When they're country owned, as Indonesia, South Africa, they go much faster than if they're imposed. The second piece is on the debt. We do not want the climate agenda to crowd in more debt for emerging and middle income countries or low income countries. So managing debt is an important part of the climate agenda, and also why we need external financing to be able to actually tackle the issue. And now we got into the financing. Now, once we have fixed what is in the country's domain, which is the policies, and we're making sure as a global community that we are not getting countries to accrue more debt to deal with the climate issue, then the next thing is, well, we still need additional financing. Where are we going to get it from? And there's a whole conversation on MDB reform and what we can do to ensure that we can increase the amount of capital from 60 billion to 180 billion is what the report is recommending that we get in terms of MDB reform. But the MDBs are not just there to bring additional capital. They are also there to ensure that they can help us as we do our national strategies, to ensure that there is coordination and collaboration, which is a word that Amar emphasized across the development institutions, but amongst countries as well, to ensure that that goes well. So MDBs, we must get a capital increase. We must increase the work that they need to do. They can be more efficient, and we know, and I'm not going to do an expose here on MDB reform and the capital increase, but MDBs, for all they need to do, still need additional capital to be able to deliver on this climate agenda. The next point is, what can the private sector do? Of course, once you have the MDBs, actually, before I go to the private sector, you have IDA. So the MDBs are essentially also mostly for the middle income countries. In the case of Africa, 75% of the countries on the continent today are middle income. But as we go down, we begin to see the low income countries. The low income countries need grants. Unfortunately, in the middle income category, we see the countries or the small island states like Barbados, like Cape Verde, like Comoros, like Seychelles, that get really hit by one climate event, and 20% of their GDP can get wiped out. The MDB and the MDB compensation from 60 to $180 billion is really to see how we can begin to design projects and programs that can help them address this. On the low income side, we saw Mozambique, 11% of its GDP that was wiped out by Hurricane Ian. What do we need to do? The low income countries still need grants. To be able to bring in capital, we need that grant funding. We need additional concessional bilateral funding. We also need philanthropy. Philanthropy has to come in, and we've seen quite a number of philanthropies from the Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, of course, the Bezos Foundation. Andrew is here with us today, and many more that are crowding in capital. We need that capital almost as sort of, first step, capital to help us design the project. There's a lot of conversations around lack of bankable projects, or even when they're good projects, to actually kick off the initial sort of brownfield design stages are quite expensive. Few capital and equity doesn't come behind that. What we need is to start the projects, and then for the World Bank and then the private sector to come in. So it's also a pipeline and a sequencing. And this, again, the MDBs can help us design, who comes in first, what kind of instrument, at what point, blended finance guarantees, and when we can use them for the different development. Then, of course, it's for the private sector, we need them to triple the investments that they're putting in. There's a lot of conversations around $1 trillion today that has been invested in the climate space, in the green energy space. A lot of it, 75% of it, is actually happening in the developed world. In Africa, we're only getting 8%. If you take out North Africa, it's 1%. So the private sector needs to come behind this more. They need to triple their investments. But even to do that, they would still need a lot of accompaniment by either concessional money or philanthropic resources to be able to come in. A final space in that is the carbon markets. And during the last COP, COP27, we just launched the Carbon Markets Initiative, the African Carbon Markets Initiative. Essentially, the carbon initiative, I see it as a twofold. It's equity. In a lot of this development, we need equity, not even loans or debt. We need actually pure equity, which comes in with technology, technological transfer. To be able to raise that, we need a carbon market that works for Africa, so that the standards that we're beginning to set around those carbon markets are actually sustainable and can help us achieve what we want to do. So what is the big number? And I deliberately did this. I didn't go to the big number first because I wanted to sort of talk about, why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? And then where do we get the big numbers from? So the big number that we're looking for, of course, and the report talks about, is excluding China. So I repeat that, it's excluding China. We're looking for $1 trillion between now and 2025 and $2.4 trillion between now and 2030 to be able to meet this climate challenge. If you think that the global GDP is somewhere in the order of $14 trillion, this is a small piece of what the global GDP is for development and for including the private sector. The G funds, as Amar said, have almost $13 trillion. Sorry, global GDP 240 trillion. What Amar said about the G funds coming together with already $130 trillion that they're putting on the table. I think our big challenge today is to see how we can convert the resources in the private sector using the resources, and this is why MDB reform is so important, is leveraging that grant capital, that concessional financing to crowd in the huge amounts of private capital that we need to deliver on an agenda that is winnable, that is doable. But as the SG said, and this is my closing point, we are losing this race if we cannot scale it up, speed, and go much faster in a much more collaborative fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Let me now turn to Yannick Glemarec, who is the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. Yannick, under your leadership, the GCF has been pushing hard on leverage and innovation as a way to scale up climate action. You have been partnering with the private sector. Your direct engagement with countries has been a central feature of your DNA. We're very interesting to hear what are the lessons you have taken away, from your solution set. So I know you have a slide presentation. The only condition I have is you do have only 10 minutes.
Okay, I will try my best, Amar. First, many thanks for having me here, and hello everybody from Songwe, South Korea, the headquarters of the Green Climate Fund. So if we can go to the first slide. In order to scale up climate action, we face two challenges. We need to increase the overall investment flow in order to address the present investment gaps that we have in almost every single sector in developing countries. And we have to ensure that this additional investment flow are green and climate resilient. And for example, if we look at only infrastructure, it can be several percentage points of the GDP of countries, the present infrastructure gap. Normally, it should be possible. If we look at the next slide, the next slide basically depict the request for proposals, the auction that UK did conduct in August 2022 for renewable energy technologies. So they had an auction for 11 gigawatt, the equivalent of 14% of the electricity consumption. And they ended up with an unbelievable strike price of 48 British pound per megawatt hour. For offshore wind, it was 37 British pound per megawatt hour. This is basically about a third of the price of nuclear, and it was 1/9 of the price of natural gas at that time. And the UK used to have this auction every 2 years. Now is to do it every year. And so because it takes between 4 to 5 years to commission all of that, they could actually reach 100% decarbonization of the power sector several years before the deadline of 2035, based on these numbers. And this is for power generation. In the next slide, we take a look at climate resilient infrastructure. There is some fabulous work that has been done by the Coalition for Climate Resilient Infrastructure, and they have conducted a number of real investment pilots looking at basically what will be the return of climate resilient infrastructure versus conventional infrastructure, and they came to quite a striking result here again, which is that for some type of assets, actually investing in climate, investing 5%, 10%, or even 15% upfront, additionally upfront, in order to make climate resilient agriculture, is not only a good business because it's reduced the downside in case of extreme climate event, but actually is even a good business in the absence of extreme climate event, because the additional information that is provided you to look at all the different type of climate future enables you to find resilience path that's maintain the operation of your assets for plenty of other possible technical problem. You provide also further information to your financier, and the net result is that you can get access to finance at a lower cost. So if you look at this, the conclusion should be, okay, fine, mission accomplished, we have done it. Next slide. No, I think despite the fact that we seem to have superior solution for power generation, superior solution for climate resilient infrastructure, basically climate finance, public and private together, has been more or less flat for the past few years. If we look at infrastructure, it was flat for the last 8 years almost. And for infrastructure, the good news was that in 2021, 60% were green, but we still had more or less the same amount of investments than the past few years, and 80% in an industrialized country and only 20% in a developing country. Even worse, we had an 8% increase in investment in infrastructure in industrial countries and 8% reduction in developing countries. And so we have a gigantic financing gap, despite the fact that we seem to have extremely attractive projects. How can we explain this paradox? Next slide. Let's imagine that. Let's go back to the UK example, and let's imagine that we take the team of engineers that have designed this offshore power plants. We take the same engineer, same technology, and we bring it to a B- country. Suddenly, this project is no more bankable. The reason why they were able to have a strike price of 37 British pounds per megawatt hour is because our financing cost must have been 4 or 5% for 15 to 20 years tenure. In a B- country, you will basically get 18% for 2 years. And so the project is absolutely not bankable. But even in countries that have a better credit rating, every single barrier to investment, such as, for example, the lack of infrastructure to offload your wind turbine, or road to transport your wind turbine, or the fact that you need the authorization of 27 different agencies to get your sitting license for your wind turbine, or the fact that you do not have maintenance, on-site maintenance capacity, and you have to fly people from the rest of the world, or the fact that you subsidize your fossil fuel energy at 80%, all of that are gigantic barrier, and these barriers will basically be translated into risk, and this risk will translate into higher financing costs. And up to a moment, a certain number of barriers and a certain number of risks will make the project completely unbankable. And like Vera just mentioned, policy equal finance. And often when you can with policy, you can reduce these financing costs. Today, the key challenge to scale up climate action is not to reduce the cost of technologies, is to reduce the cost of financing of these technologies. And there are plenty of policy instruments that can reduce the cost of these technologies. For example, in the case of a low sovereign credit rating that prevent you from issuing a green bond, we can come with green guarantee companies that will provide 100% guarantee for a high quality project, and that's the credit rating of that company which will be taken into action. So rather than 18% for 2 years, you will get maybe 6-8% for 10 or 15 years. So there are plenty of instruments that can be used. And the objective is, next slide, is to move from the situation where green investment are basically potentially less attractive in a high-cost environment because of the higher capital expenditure, and the lower OPEX are not enough to compensate for the much higher capital expenditure with a very high financing cost. And also the fact that maybe because of a number of policy barriers, you have a major risk of delays in commissioning that could translate up to a default for the company, where we have to move to a case where the financing cost of green technology is affordable long-term and affordable enough so that green technology becomes much more attractive. And at the same time, we have to help investors to reassess climate risk and realize that actually the term de-risking is misleading. We speak about de-risking green technologies, but often green technologies are less risky. And when you incorporate the physical and the transition risk of climate change, you suddenly realize that not only your green project will be more attractive financially, in fine, but in addition, you do not have a risk of total collapse because of physical or transition, climate physical or transition risk. Next slide. There are about 5,500 different public policy instruments that have been developed throughout the world according to the International Energy Agency. And next slide, they can be divided into two parts. The first 5 type of instruments, the information instruments, the regulatory instruments, the economic and market instruments, and the institutional instruments, enable you to foster systemic change, both on the supply side and the demand side of the market. And so there you create, to come back to what we're saying, Vera, you create this enabling environment. No, you do not have to wait for perfection to be able to immediately roll out green investment that will establish a commercial track record that will enable financiers to reassess risk and reprice the financing. The fifth category, next slide. The fifth category of instrument are financial de-risking instrument. And there's one, even if the overall environment is not perfect, you can basically address a lot of the residual risk using a number of different financial de-risking instruments. And I will give one example, which is a project, next slide, $800 million infrastructure equity fund that's implemented by FMO. FMO is one of the 114 partners of GCF. We work from some of the largest commercial banks in the world, such as Mitsubishi Bank, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, to civil society organizations working at the community level, such as CI, WWF, 5Cs, etc. And so FMO is one of our partners. And so what we decided is that we provided to FMO $20 million in grants for project development and $80 million in first loss equity to enable them to get to reassure institutional investors to invest. And this project has 3 components. That's actually mirror quite a lot of what Vera said. The first component is a project development fund in grant. We give grant to entrepreneurs. It's pre-financial closure and pre-commissioning are extraordinary risky periods for entrepreneurs. In some geography, only 1 out of 10 projects reach commercial closure. And so there we provide grant to entrepreneurs who invest in green infrastructures. If the project is successfully closed, and there we provide equity construction up to commissioning, and the money that we have provided in grant is reimbursed, converted into equity. Plus, we provide additional equity up to the moment where we bring it to commissioning. And a green project after 2 years after commissioning becomes plain vanilla because here again, you have much less operation and maintenance. And there, the idea for the third basket is to basically issue a green ABS, asset-backed security, plenty of infrastructure bring together to be securitized, to be offloaded to domestic or international capital markets to enable refinancing. And so this project basically is trying to establish a track record in several Asian countries for renewable energy, for 30 projects that will be financed. We have already 14 ongoing with leveraging ratio of ranging from 9 to 80. And hopefully also to prime a green ABS market that will enable the market to scale up this initiative. So we will have a successful commercial track record and the financial mechanism for scaling up. No, my last slide, next one, is about GCF. I hope, Amar, that I'm still in the time. So the first few slides were showing basically the illustrated the strong belief of GCF that we have to use public money as a catalyst to accelerate green market formation. And we can accelerate green market creation by basically fostering systemic change to create an enabling environment and by de-risking targeted projects that will create a commercial track record. And so for our period 2024-2027, we are currently discussing with our board our 5 programmatic objectives. The first one is to enable countries to translate their NDCs and NAPs into bankable projects and put in place an enabling environment. And ownership, I 100% subscribe to what Vera said. Ownership is critical. You will not have policy without ownership. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is to accelerate innovation in developing countries. Most of the innovation that will be needed for us to transition to a green, climate resilient future will have to happen in developing countries because a lot of this innovation do not make sense in OECD countries. Unfortunately, in the developing countries, it's very difficult for entrepreneurs to get support for refining their business model and to get early growth finance. So there what we do is that we are supporting climate incubators and accelerators in developing countries and developing specialty early growth financing instruments. Objective 3 is basically loss and damage, where we intervene a lot in the area of universal early warning system coverage and urgent emergency support up to the community level for minimizing action. And the fourth one is basically about developing co-investment platform. That's rather than de-risking one project, the idea is to bring 10, 20, 30 of our 114 partners together to have a co-investment platform where it's $5–10 billion worth of projects that we will de-risk in one go, because we don't have the time anymore to have a project-by-project basis approach. We need to move toward co-investment platform. And we are basically working on co-investment platform for energy, for infrastructure, for food system transition, and for nature positive transition. And Andrew and I were in a meeting in The Hague last week on the possible food system transition platform. And the fifth objective is greening finance. It's basically not green finance, greening finance. It's to enable domestic financial institutions to incorporate climate risk into investment decision making and appraise climate projects and access different type of financings to support them. Ultimately, a financier is parochial. You invest in the technologies, the communities, and the practices that you are familiar. And so a lot of the money will have to come also through strengthening domestic financial system. And I will stop here, Amar.
Thank you, Yannick. There's a lot there that we can go into, and we will in the Q&A part of this conversation. But let me turn right away to Andrew Steer. Andrew, as president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, which is the largest ever philanthropic commitment to climate action and nature, and which I know you are trying to use as an amplifier for climate action. what is the approach that you are taking in terms of the impact, and what does that imply in terms of scaling?
Well, first, thanks, Amar. Thanks, Johannes. Thanks, George, for organizing this. This is a really fascinating discussion, and we've had two brilliant presentations. And Vera gave us an incredible sort of macro story and the kinds of reforms we need in the international financial system. And then, Yannick brought us down to earth. How do you actually use resources really effectively? And you will be missed at the Green Climate Fund, Yannick. So maybe I could sort of say something that complements that a little bit. The way we look at things is basically $3 trillion a year will be needed to invest so that we can stay below 1.5 and do the things that are required. And it's tempting to think, my goodness me, $3 trillion, that's impossible, isn't it? Well, it turns out that most of that money is out there already. We will need some increases in saving, which is where investment sort of is financed from. But basically, the issue is that money is going to the wrong place. And what we need to do, of course, is to nudge it, cajole it, prod it, force it, use whatever instruments at our disposal to get the money to go to the right place. And philanthropy has a useful role. I mean, roughly speaking, if you look at all the money that's available from philanthropy that can address both climate mitigation and adaptation, roughly somewhere between 20 and 30 billion, rising quite fast. So it's 30 billion, that's basically 1% of the resources that are required in order to get the green transition. So it's terribly important that that 1% is used extremely carefully to try and scale. In other words, we need to use that money to leverage real change. So, for example, if we were to use our resources simply to build, a solar park on our own, and that was it, that would not be a very good investment. It'd be nice to have one more solar park, but it wouldn't actually advance towards those positive tipping points. And that's how we then move towards the question of what needs to be done and how could we inject the resources and the influence we have in a fairly sort of forensic sort of way so that we unblock the transition. So the way we look at it is, there are obviously big transitions in energy, in the food systems, in cities. Those buckets are really too big to be useful. If you actually disaggregate them, so for example, we include, you've got to get rid of the internal combustion engine this decade. We've got to reduce food loss and waste by half this decade. We've got to decarbonize a cow this decade, stop belching methane, for example. We've got to restore 200 million hectares of land and suck down carbon this decade. And if you add all those up, there are about 50 such transitions that are required. And that's how we approach things. We run together with WRI and some others, something called the System Change Lab. And what we do is we monitor each of these transitions. And we ask the question, where are they on their journey towards a positive tipping point? And a positive tipping point basically is defined by change then becomes irresistible and unstoppable. So, wind energy in Texas has crossed a tipping point, certainly doesn't need any help from us. There are some that at the other end, they're just stuck in the mud. And what we try and do is we ask the question, what is the special source that gets a transition to a tipping point? And if you really can diagnose that, and you can ask, where are they each on that path? We can then start asking the question, how could we engage in a way that would unblock so that we could get towards that tipping point? And then what we would do is we would have a whole set of instruments that we can use that would be appropriate in different situations. So, for example, could be primary research because the technology is not yet mature enough, prices haven't reached parity. So, for example, the example of, say, reducing methane emissions from cows, that still needs serious research. So we can finance basic research and accelerate that as much as possible. There will be other areas in which we're trying to, we need to change behavior, shifting towards more plant-based diets. So that would require a different kind of intervention. And one can look at a whole range of such possibilities. So for example, we have to decarbonize cement in the next decade and a half, basically, where it turns out, for example, that 50% of all the cement is actually bought by governments. So in this country, whilst we can't get a federal rule that says, look, if you are a public procurer, you will give favor to low carbon cement, actually at the state level you can. And so there's a growing number of states that have been influenced by philanthropy through really great lobbying and really serious technical work, so that state by state we're gradually moving to the right direction. Now, one of the most important sort of insights to us on scaling is the importance of coalitions of like-minded leaders who can encourage themselves, encourage each other. Because what's happening at the moment is that around the world, corporations have made well-meaning plans to decarbonize what they're doing. And actually, they're now waking up, it's Monday morning, and they're actually discovering it's actually harder than they thought. So it's incredibly important that we create the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that will encourage continued discipline and progress. So I'll give you an example. If you think about the hard to abate sectors, which turn out are not quite as hard to abate as we thought, and that is cement, it's steel, it's ocean transportation, it's airlines and so on, really sort of hard to abate. Turns out though, actually what you need is you need a hydrogen economy, basically. It has to be green hydrogen. Well, that's actually quite complicated. It takes a couple of $1 billion to invest in that. You need cement companies that actually have some reason to know that they are not going to be penalized for being the first out there, whereby cement may cost 30% more if you decarbonize it. You need the same for steel companies. Steel companies, if you want green steel, it will cost you 50% more than regular steel. But actually, it turns out that if you buy an automobile built with green steel, it will only cost 1% more because the steel is a relatively small part. So what you need to do, and what we're doing right now, is we're saying, look, let's see if we could pick a couple of hubs. We picked Houston and Los Angeles. And we said, look, could we bring the different pieces together? Let's bring the cement companies, the steel companies, both who need hydrogen, and the shipping companies, which also need hydrogen, which then is turned into ammonia. Could we then bring the investors in green hydrogen? There also needs to be a lot of renewable energy in order to create the green hydrogen. You then need to bring the governor of the state and the mayor of the city, the federal government together. You need to bring the financial instruments together. And you need to bring, for example, the automobile sector. Actually, bringing that sort of group together, suddenly there can be a sort of aha moment. My goodness me, this is going to work if we put all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. And it turns out that it won't lead to a huge economic loss. It will turn Houston, which is currently an oil city, into a city which is actually going to drive into the 2020s, 2030s, and 2040s, and is going to be a model and is going to be much more prosperous as a result. So for us, an extremely important element of the entire the entire scaling is this notion of bringing coalitions together. Now, in addition to the sort of sectoral issues, we've got to decarbonize food, we've got to decarbonize steel, we've got to decarbonize energy and so on. One also needs to think, as both Vera and Yannick were saying, about, if you like, the systemic issues that cross, and that includes reforming the multilateral banking system. It requires actually greening the entire financial system. And here we've seen a sort of a amazing development, as you know, over the last 2 years. I mean, those of us who have been in this space a long time would never have dreamt that $130 trillion of assets under management would, in Glasgow, be pledged to become net zero by the middle of the century. And if you think what that means, it's stunning, actually. That means that the tens of thousands of loans that are made to companies, those companies, we would need to know that they are net zero in order for the overall portfolio to be net zero. Now, it turns out, of course, that many of these banks and financial institutions didn't really understand what this meant. So what we and others now need to do is work with them to clarify really what net zero means, to clarify an accountability framework so that, in fact, those that do honor this will be rewarded by those sort of pots of money that truly want to be part of the right thing. So we invest very heavily in, if you like, standard setting and accountability mechanism. Standard setting, for example, greenhouse gas protocol. That needs real support because that's how you measure greenhouse gases. CDP, that's how you register your greenhouse gases. Science-Based Targets Initiative, that's how you set standards. SBTR, the various carbon market rules, that's how those policies are set, as Vera was saying. So we need to, that's an example of the kind of, if you like, system-wide change that we can all play. So for us, it's a real privilege. It's a big responsibility to have, in our case, I mean, we're privileged that Jeff Bezos committed $10 billion of grants to be dispersed this decade for climate and nature. And every single one of those dollars has to be injected in a way that creates that momentum towards a tipping point and towards sort of irresistibility and unstoppability. So let me stop there. Back to you, Amar.
Thank you, Andrew. And just to put you on notice, there's a question already for you in the chat box. So I will move now to our last speaker, Ian Mitchell. Ian is a senior fellow and the director for development cooperation in Europe for the Center for Global Development. He has been focusing particularly on the issue of not just the scale of finance, but the effectiveness of climate finance. And so, Ian, over to you in terms of sharing your insights.
Great, Amar, thank you very much. And a bit like Andrew, I mean, I can see the coherence of this panel coming together. Andrew mentioned the 20 or 30 billion of philanthropic funding that needs to be catalytic, and I'm going to focus on the official concessional finance from governments, that 80 billion of climate finance and how well that is spent. And I suppose I wanted to start. I mean, we will get onto the effectiveness, but the session was set up and talked about unlocking finance, and I think there's some important issues coming up in the coming years that will have a bearing on that precious concessional government finance and how much there is. And I think we should learn the lessons from last time. So we've had this 100 billion climate finance target. The OECD report, 83 billion has been achieved, but we've done some work to say, well, the overall envelope of all development finance over that decade or more now, 15 years almost, actually only increased 47 billion. So what we're seeing with that 83 billion is a big chunk of it is coming from existing development finance and either being rebadged or refocused. And actually the amount of concessional finance that's being provided hasn't really changed as a share of GNI. So I think as we approach the new quantified collective climate finance goal that will exist post 2025, we should think about the incentive that creates and how that's designed to make sure there is new finance going into the system. So, I think the last target has incentivized lending, and we're seeing the problems now with lending. The ODA rules, the definition of aid, has also led to sort of the overcounting of loans and their grant equivalents. And I think mitigation is also easier to do for many development agencies, and perhaps that's why we've seen so much emphasis on mitigation relative to adaptation. Although now we've seen some of a correction with the goal for 2025 to spend 40 billion on adaptation. So I'm not going to talk more about the climate finance target, but I think there's an important agenda there, and people working in development agencies should be not just ambitious about the number on the tin, but about the coherence of that target with development finance, and as I think Vera said at the start, recognise that really that these things go hand in hand. So let's move on to how well climate finance is spent and by development agencies and whether it's going to achieve the kind of things that Andrew was highlighting and Yannick is hoping for. And we, I think in the context here, climate finance is relatively new. I mean, obviously there were climate projects 20 years ago in development, but it's been a really dramatic step up for development agencies to deal with. So maybe it's at least quadrupled, I would say, in a decade, and so perhaps unsurprisingly, it's still a relatively new modality, and we think that it looks like it hasn't learned all of the lessons of development effectiveness that were, some of which were tackled under the Paris Agenda. My colleague Beata Sekotska led a report which we published in December that made a comparison between development finance and climate finance, and I'm going to share some of the insights from that report with you. So the headline is that there are 6 major challenges for climate finance in the comparison, and I'll go through them quite promptly, and you can look into the report later if you're interested, but I'll highlight a few. I mean, one that won't come as a surprise to anyone that works on this agenda is that disbursement rates are much lower in climate finance. In normal development finance, about 90% of commitments are turned into disbursements, but for climate, it's 59% on adaptation and 75% on mitigation. So the complaints of recipients are substantiated by these figures, and as we were saying at the start, given the urgency and the scale of what needs to happen, that absolutely needs to be tackled, and I'll come on to some of what's happening to deal with that. The debt sustainability point, Vera said at the start that debt isn't going to cut it for many of these countries given the existing levels of debt, and actually you're seeing a trend over time. If you just look at the most indebted low-income countries, the climate finance they are now receiving, 30% of it is loan-based. So these are already highly indebted, and nearly a third of the finance they're getting is in loan form. So I think there is, going back to the target and the incentives built into it, there is a problem of an emphasis on lending, and that will show up in the coming years. So if you're in development agencies, you should definitely be thinking about that. The third challenge is that there are more providers on climate finance than ever before, and more than on education and health, but they're delivering smaller projects than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So there are 59 climate finance providers relative to 47 on education and health globally. So 59 different potential sources of funding on a climate project. And the project size has shrunk by 25% over the period that I mentioned. So yeah, really problematic in terms of transformational change when the project size in low-income countries is just $3 million on average. The fourth challenge we had was one we see in a lot of development agencies, including the UK, that the rise of unidentified recipients. So this is development finance, but without a specified country that's receiving it. And obviously in a global public goods situation with mitigation, you can see how there might be a case for some of that investment, but it is rising all the time, and it is now 29% of finance for mitigation. So I think there's a challenge there for trust in development finance, and a question as well about how well that money is being spent. The fifth challenge we've got, again, is a common issue for development finance, is the use of country institutions in climate finance, where we find it's behind the curve on other types of aid in terms of involving country-based institutions. We know the US is trying to tackle this with its localization agenda. But it's a particular challenge when you're trying to build the capacity of governments for transformational change when you're not necessarily working with those governments. The one I wanted to finish on, the sixth challenge, I think in some ways is the biggest one of all, and that's that we're looking for catalytic change, we're looking for systems change, but actually in terms of the evaluation evidence we have on climate finance, it's almost non-existent. So at least in terms of the high quality evidence, if you look in 3IE's database of evaluations, high quality evaluations, there are over 10,000 published there. Less than 120 of those relate to climate. There are very few synthesis papers, and so that even though that's only the high quality evidence, we're starting from a very low base in terms of our knowledge. So when it comes to things like JETPs and other projects that we've been talking about, I think there's a really important point about making sure that the measurement and the monitoring is in place to both see whether the projects are having the transformational effect that we want, but also to share that learning so that in other contexts we can understand how best to design things and the prices that are paid for different sources of energy and so on. So I think this is a huge agenda. We at CGD are playing our part in trying to improve that, but I think it's a major challenge for multilaterals and bilaterals. It's a good moment to give a shout out actually to the Green Climate Fund and to Yannick, because they actually do make their project data available on mitigation that has enabled us to do some evaluation of impact, and I would really encourage all development providers to be doing that. So yeah, so that's me. I think there are some promising efforts to address these areas in terms of the delivery action plan from Canada and Germany and the access task force that the UK set up, but I don't think they're going quick enough, and I think this needs much more commitment. Back to you, Amar.
Many thanks, Ian. So we have about 20 minutes for some questions. I want to maybe begin with Andrew, and Andrew, it's not just Bezos Earth Fund operating by itself in today's environment, but it's actually private philanthropy working together in also a lot of the transformation possibilities. So it'd be very interesting to hear from you on how private philanthropy is coming together. You've been key player in many initiatives, including the Bridgetown initiative, and as you said, a lot of this is coalition building and leadership. And of course, you're providing that yourself, but how do you see the prospect? A second question I have is really related a little bit to the kind of headwinds that we are running into, particularly in the United States, around climate action and the financial agenda around climate action. What role do you think you and others could play, in informing the agenda so that this doesn't become seen as part of the anti-woke movement here in the US? And then there was a question specifically around technology to you. So maybe we could begin with you, and then I'll go down the list.
Great, thank you, Amar. Well, you're quite right. I think we are at a very interesting point in history in terms of how different players work together. You and I both worked for the World Bank. When I joined the World Bank, it was World Bank dealt with governments, and if you wanted to address deforestation in Indonesia, government would pass some policy. You'd provide a government, loan. We'd work with a palm oil, state-owned enterprises. That seems like the, ancient history now. That will never solve the problem. The problem will be solved when different players come together. And as we think, by the way, of MDB reform, it's not only the balance sheets that need to be changed, it's the ability and the thrill of working, with the private sector, with the philanthropic sector, with the smallholder palm oil producers sector. So for example, I'll give you an example right now, a very live one. As you know, there's something called JETP. That's the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So led by governments, South Africa, and then, 4 European and United States government, same thing in Indonesia, same thing in Vietnam. Great that you have that political engagement. But actually then you need to think about the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. And that requires, the DFCs. So right after this call, we've got a session with the US DFC to think through what would it take actually to bring in philanthropic money that maybe could help in this part, maybe the just transition part, maybe the retraining part, maybe the de-risking part. And maybe actually we could work with voluntary carbon markets, as we are with John Kerry, to bring in carbon money, which is which is like grant money if it's done well, and that in turn can de-risk as well. So we're at a stage in history where solutions will never come just from the private sector, never come from the government, never come from NGOs on their own. It's only if we work together. So if you want to address deforestation in Southeast Asia, yes, you need the government of Indonesia. Yes, you need the World Bank involved. But yes, you also need Unilever, who are buying in Singapore every day, and 100 other companies are purchasing. You need WRI because it can measure actually every tree falling. So of the 1,000 palm oil mills in Southeast Asia, about 700 are pretty honorable, 300 aren't. Somebody needs to tell the purchasers, don't buy from that. But then we need Walmart to be involved. We need the manufacturers to be involved. And we need you and I, both of whom have used palm oil 3 times today already, probably, because half of all the goods in a supermarket in Washington, D.C. have palm oil in them. We need to know, is that sustainable? So in other words, we're at an incredibly exciting time where you've got to put the entire supply chain together, very complicated. But if we're not able to do that, we will not solve the problem. And so what we try and do is look across that and inject money well. On your second question, Amar, you're absolutely right. There is a real risk, as I think the Secretary General, I think it was him, mentioned recently, that COP28, the risk is that it will be the obituary for 1.5. In other words, we will conclude it's too difficult. You give up, maybe 2 degrees. That would be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. And it's just very easy at the moment in boardrooms around the world, certainly as sort of right-wing politicians, for heaven's sake, this is too difficult. And what you've played a very important role, Amar, yourself, and hopefully we all have, in showing that actually smart climate action will drive more economic efficiency. It will drive new technologies. It will shift expectations towards a much better future, and it will lower risk. And we need to get that message out, a message of hope. It's not too late to get to 1.5, but we need to do a much better job. Now, the good news is that even the Republicans in this country now are actually looking for a positive way of playing a role. And issues, highly controversial issues like CBAMs, the taxes on carbon-intensive imports, that's maybe a sort of compromise. The EU's led on that. Maybe other countries need to follow.
Thank you, Andrew. If I could turn to you, Vera. So the two, you wear multiple hats, and I'm going to use your multiple hats to ask my question. So one is, could you share, given your involvement in the Bridgetown initiative, particularly how we ramp up on adaptation and resilience? Because that's a key issue. A lot of, as a question posed to the panel, a lot of focus on mitigation, but what about adaptation and resilience? And the Bridgetown initiative has sought to ramp up. And associated with that, how do we use more innovative ways to augment climate finance? Ian talks about official climate finance, but we know that will not be enough. And you have talked about the role of SDRs, you've talked about the role of debt swaps, and you mentioned carbon. So 2 questions for you. Can you share some perspectives from what you see as the momentum that we can gain from the Bridgetown initiative, and how do we expand, concessional finance through more innovative options?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Amar. I think I'll be brief so that we can get more questions. But 3 things quickly on the Bridgetown initiative. And Andrew has already spoken about it, and you have. Really, the Bridgetown initiative, I think, is trying to see how we bring together a lot of the conversations around MDB reform, first of all, and to say, let's put it together in a coordinated and collaborative way. Because, again, as I said, we do need MDBs, we do need concessional financing, but we also need their convening and collaborative powers. But a most important component of the Bridgetown initiative, as refers to your question, Amar, is around, exactly as you said, adaptation. And the whole sort of second part of our report in terms of what's the resources that are needed in the order of $150 billion for loss and damage and adaptation. The point really comes from a place where we say that when there is a climate event in any one of these islands, they lose 20-30% of their GDP. That means they have to build back or build forward, but they are also still needing to service the existing debt that they had or on a growth projection that is now totally different from what it was agreed before. So the question then becomes, can we build and design new instruments, catastrophic bonds, catastrophic stay instruments that would say, in the event that you have a climate event, can we suspend your debt service payment? So a kind of, I would call it, another way of looking at it is a enhanced debt service suspension initiative around catastrophic events, so that the minute you have an event like that, you immediately globally, so not just for the multilateral development institutions, because as we know, many countries are now also exposed to the markets, but can we get agreements even with the markets to say, for a country that gets this kind of event, we give them a 4 or 5 year time to rebuild before they go back into servicing their debt? Can we create new and innovative mechanisms like that? The IMF on that scheme with Barbados has just started. The World Bank also had a catastrophic bond. So we're looking at how we design this. We have to be careful, though, that the way we design them is actually in reality an addition for those countries, and not just a sense that, if something happens, we'll give you a few years, but you will still pay, which is, I think, what is happening now. So I think we need to come back and look at it. It's a win, because at least we are agreeing with the initiative, but I will go a little bit further to say that we shouldn't, again, emerging market economies, low-income economies, exposed, vulnerable, middle-income economies should not be the ones who are made to pay for this. I think in the insurance sector, there is a lot of new and innovative ways of managing insurance around that. In the agriculture sector, I think there is a lot more with AMET and different sort of the meteorological association looking at data to ensure that we can get farmers the right kind of insurance to make sure that if there is an event, and Africa with the African risk capacity mechanism is actually paying out good and substantive deals. The biggest and most challenging thing on the adaptation side, I think, is a narrative that one of my jobs is to maybe take away, is that adaptation is not a good business segment of the climate discussions, and so this is really only for the public sector. There is a big part of adaptation that is for the public sector, especially when we're now talking about loss and damage, which means after the event. But we can build resilience, which means building greener houses, which means doing things in a more sustainable manner. And there's a huge profit making that could be put in place. And I think we do need to, part of our job on this panel and outside is to begin to look at those avenues for where the private sector, and I think Macquarie and a couple of other businesses are actually doing studies now to see what are the private sector enabling segments of the adaptation conversation, so we can crowd in more private sector, so that the G funds don't only go to energy transformation, but they can actually come also to the adaptation conversation. I think that's a very important part of the conversation. The second part of your question was on.
I think we'll skip that right now. I am being told that we have a time limit, so I think you mentioned already carbon markets, but I wanted to just you've been a real champion on enhanced use of SDRs and also on debt swaps, and your leadership in the Economic Commission for Africa. But let me just salute that, and then maybe if I move to Yannick. Yannick, the question, you highlighted very much the need to bring together many elements, the enabling environment, as you put it, a much more granular approach to risk, taking into account the different stages, as it were, of the value proposition. And you also mentioned, the need to go from beyond project to system impact and engagement. The question I have, and it's a little bit, based on, the frontiers that you have been pushing, what do you see as the big impediments to really scaling up? What do you find are areas where not just the GCF, but the international community needs to focus? And you have also been a great champion of platforms. you were the first person I remember, that came out with the idea of a platform for the climate space. How do you see, what would it take to really make the jet piece successful? How do you go beyond the jet piece? Now, you could take 1 hour to answer that question, but you have 3 minutes.
The first for the first part of your questions, as I mentioned during my presentation, today the key issue is not the price of the technology, it's the price of the financing of that technology. To really scale up climate action, we need to lower the financing cost by de-risking investment and by diversifying sources of finance. And repricing, de-risking investment, and diversifying sources of finance. Notably, we need to green the financing sector. We need to deepen domestic capital market. We need to facilitate access to international capital markets, and we need to look at plenty of other sources of financing. Actually, in the Bridgestone initiative, I was quite taken by the suggestion of a 2% levy on oil and gas import. There was, over the past 2 days, we had headlines about Exxon having made $52 billion of profit, Shell $40 billion. And I felt bad for the third one. I think it was, Chevron, who had only made $36 billion. We need to lower the financing cost by de-risking investment and by diversifying sources of finance. The co-investment platform is it's a bit in line with what Andrew was saying. We are running out of time, literally, and so there what we would like to do is that it's to bring public and private sector together. 5 private banks, 2 development banks, 2 equity funds, 5 civil society organizations behind a common theory of change to achieve transformative change. And so, for example, we are working right now with 6 development finance institutions on what could be a major platform for green and sustainable debt finance. And there, the idea is that we will come up with an investment vehicle which will enable us to act as an anchor investor to buy let's say 10% of different type of bonds, and to enable it and to buy the bonds, the green and climate resilient bonds that will be issued by LDCs and African states. If we are to finance climate action, we will have to finance this with bonds. Infrastructure is financed with bonds almost everywhere in the world, but right now Africa accounts for 0.8% of the 0.77% of the bond market. And so there we are bringing several people, several agencies together to be able to work with 20, 30 countries in a go. We are working on a co-investment platform for blue economy with all the Caribbean seed and all the Pacific seeds. And there this platform will be looking at renewable energy, at circular economy, at marine and coastal livelihood, at marine protected areas, and we will be exploring different type of financing instruments to support it. And you were mentioning debt for swap. In Barbados, they had something quite extraordinary. They had a very interesting debt for swap for marine protected area. Also, the debt was being traded at par. And so there, what they did is that they issued a blue bond that enables them to access long-term finance at a lower cost to refinance their existing debt, and the savings were invested in marine protected areas. In Indonesia, we are working basically on issuing for $300 million of blue bonds to enable the fishing industry to equip itself with a cold storage chain, and the fishing boat will have access to this finance for the cold chain if they subscribe to a zero post-catch loss and with cold storage and minimum size catch, and they will be given the authorization to go to fish in the yellow area of marine protected areas where you have more fish. And this bond will be reimbursed through increased fiscal revenue because we will unload the cash in places where they have a cold storage. And if it's not enough, we can, if the increased fiscal revenue are not enough, we can think in terms of blue carbon, in terms of ocean conservation credit, and so bring different type of financing mechanism. If we make it work, we have a solution for financing all marine protected areas in the world. So for me, the LESCO investment platform is a bit what was saying Andrew. It's let's forget about the one agency financing one project. We bring all the stakeholders together behind a common theory of change for systemic change, and we systematically explore different sources of finance.
Thank you, Yannick. So last I go to Ian. Ian, you've highlighted, some of the difficulties, including fragmentation, lack of transparency, and also, lack of effective evaluation, monitoring and evaluation with regard to climate finance. So there's one approach, which is to really kind of focus more on climate finance and get it right. And just to push you a little bit, as we heard, today, climate is development and development is climate. And separating the two is a little bit artificial. So how about taking a different approach, which is let us integrate climate finance more fully into development finance?
Thanks, Amar. And I think that makes sense. It's clear that climate change is going to have a massive impact on lower income countries, regardless of how much mitigation we now achieve. And so in that respect, climate and development are inseparable. But I think where there are difficulties is when, commitments made on climate finance and commitments made on ODA are counted twice, essentially. And so, I think you've seen with the 100 billion target, there's been a breakdown in trust from lower income countries alongside the failure to deliver vaccines. That is creating a problem in a situation where you need the whole world to take common action. Not fulfilling your commitments on a relatively small climate finance target seems to be self-defeating. So I completely agree that climate and development need to be integrated, but I think that the risk becomes, but we need to be careful that we don't use that as an excuse to miss targets. And I think someone put in the chat, I think helpfully, there's a question about adaptation, which I think has been neglected, as a consequence, as I was saying earlier, of the design of the target. And that really it's difficult to distinguish that from development finance more generally. Your resilience to climate change is surely a function of your income per head, of your health system, of your roads network. All of these things will matter to how well you can cope with the effects of climate change and agriculture. So I absolutely, so that's where I think they're probably most closely aligned. I think, as Andrew was saying, for mitigation, you really need you need to use the public money for the absolutely catalytic transformational things. I think if mitigation costs a lot more money in very poor countries who are barely emitting a ton per head, then that mitigation money isn't going to be well spent. And I think we've seen some examples where a lot of money has been spent on reducing the footprint of very small footprints. And that money is not well used. And so I think we need to get that nuance into the discussion to make sure the money is used well.
Thank you, Ian. We can continue this conversation. I think the chat box has had several questions that we didn't have the time to take up. The chat box also has a lot of information on documents that have been put out that this panel referred to. And with that, I hand over to George.
Thank you, Amar, and thank you, colleagues, for the presentations, as well as everyone who joined today's working group session. It was nearly 3 years ago when this working group was established as a scaling up community of practice. Had 8 working groups, and the newest one is the one on climate change. And the aspiration was indeed to bring parties together, and that includes not only practitioners, but also, like we had today, Ian and Beata presenting their study and the findings, so that the research can come closer to the institutions, as well as other different sources of funding can talk to each other. colleagues Yannick and Andrew have alluded to partnerships and the importance of it, and others as well. And I think this was a fascinating example of how partnerships start, not only on the ground, but in these forums, and how different opportunities can be explored through different innovative approaches. Now, I'm not going to take too much time, but definitely thank one more time everybody for their time and for their commitment, particularly Johannes for all the hard work and being behind the scenes supporting this process. It's been greatly appreciated to have Johannes and Brookings really providing all the resources that this working group and the Scaling Up Community of Practice needs to have it running. Thank you, everyone, and keep an eye on the website that was referenced earlier. There will be more updates, and you will hear more news about the working group and the upcoming activities. With this, have a good morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye.